Today we're starting with a fireside chat without fire, unfortunately. I'm so sorry, we did the wrong move. But with Mark Lutter, who has come many times at Foresight to give lots of discussion and talk, so all friends in that sense. To talk about charter cities. So, do you want to tell us like what they are, how you're thinking about them these days, why it's important, where things are at, like your progress update on charter cities?
So maybe a little bit of background about myself. I'm trained as an economist. I did my PhD at George Mason. Graduated 6 years ago. 5 years ago, I started the Charter Cities Institute, which is a nonprofit building the ecosystem for charter cities. Charter cities basically being new cities with better laws. If we look at Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dubai, they all demonstrated that with the right kind of initial conditions and luck, it's possible to grow into a world-class city in one human lifetime, if not less. And right now there are over 75 million new urban residents annually, mostly in Africa and Asia. We're undergoing the last wave of urbanization in human history. We hope, unless we really de-urbanize, but right, we're undergoing this final wave, and if we can get the right systems, both in terms of like governance structures, making it easy to register a business, to hire people, to invest, etc., as well as the right infrastructure in terms of properly delineating public and private spaces, we can create the framework for much more success in a lot of these new urban environments, instead of the alternative where they might be condemned to poverty for 1 to more generations. And so the Charter Cities Institute works in Africa and Latin America, mostly in Africa, with governments as well as new city developers to help create these legal and regulatory frameworks that can lead to sustained economic growth. And then about 9 months ago, I came across an opportunity to build a city, which I find a little bit more fun than talking about building a city. And so I left my role at the Charter Cities Institute. I'm still involved, I'm still on the board, but no longer involved in the day-to-day. And now I've been negotiating with a country as well as a large landowner to acquire about 70,000 acres of land in the Caribbean to develop a new city there, and working with the government to create a new, basically special economic zone framework that will allow us to become very competitive, attract investment, create jobs, and scale, economically grow over time. And hopefully we can announce in July. Timelines are uncertain because it's a complicated three-way negotiation, but it's been a very interesting experience kind of engaging these different counterparties, getting a sense of learning how they think, and also trying to put together what's kind of a very large private equity deal at a time when the markets are melting down. So that's a fun curveball. But our investors are very much like this project, so I think we're lucky to be in that position. So I don't know if you want to ask questions, or I can keep going.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely have questions, and also this is a participative session, so like I really encourage you to engage. Basically, I'll ask questions until you're asking questions and we get the discussion going. So if you want me to shut up, just raise your hand. So what's the state of generally things today, like taking stock, a little bit grounding, and the question would be like, what needs to change? What are maybe the bottlenecks? What are the priorities for this to work?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm actually relatively pessimistic on the charter city space broadly, with the exception of the project I'm working on. Finding land that works is extremely difficult. Finding a government that's willing to cut a deal is extremely difficult. I don't think there are many actual physical locations that can meaningfully instantiate these projects. And I think I see a lot of, optimism online where people like building communities, people imagine living in communities, but don't deal with kind of some of the real world practicalities of hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in investment in infrastructure necessary to activate these projects, in terms of dealing with governments that tend to be a little bit resistant to very large infrastructure projects because of environmental and social reasons, in terms of identifying land that you can acquire at a low enough cost basis to actually justify those investments and have a reasonable return on capital. What are the bottlenecks? I think it's kind of twofold. If we look at kind of the broader space, particularly the Charter Cities Institute, where we're doing a lot of work in Africa, a lot of it's kind of awareness and knowledge. So we opened our office in Zambia about a year ago, and we've gotten good progress. We have the Financial Times that appears to be interested in writing an article about us, but it's still like, here's this new idea, here's this weird idea. COVID slowed us down because sharing new weird ideas on Zoom is much more difficult than when you go visit people in person. You can grab a drink after dinner, etc. But there it's largely kind of awareness, and the two, basically figuring out the financial model. Like, we're getting pretty decent government buy-in. The next question is, all right, if we have government buy-in, how do we finance infrastructure? And in Africa, at least, most finance is DFIs, development finance institutions, which is like World Bank, African Development Bank. These tend to be large, bureaucratic, and relatively conservative. There is not much private infrastructure capital floating around, and what does float around tends to be Middle Eastern on East and North Africa. And Middle Eastern capital is actually relatively good and effective, makes decisions quickly, but tends to be relatively vision constrained. And then in the project I'm working on now, the company is called Bravo Cities, so I'll just call it Bravo Cities. There the constraint is we've got high level buy-in from the government. The asset is owned by two families. One of the families is strongly supportive. The other family is getting their feet wet. And so it's basically going to be probably a 2 to 3 month negotiation with them to get them comfortable, because it's been in the family for 50 years. The primary woman, her father, is buried on the island. There's a lot of personal attachment, and she needs to be wooed to kind of see the obvious financial benefit for her, but also the kind of larger development benefit that I think she believes in, but is also just because it's a major decision, is a little bit cautious about it. So that's the kind of immediate goal. And then the medium goal, which is going to be difficult, we have high level buy-in from the government, and we're in a strong negotiating position, but getting high level buy-in is much easier than kind of actually getting documents signed and that type of negotiation. And so I expect once kind of rubber meets the road, it's going to be a pretty tough negotiation with the government in terms of, can we flesh out what this new special economic zone structure actually looks like? Can we get what we need in terms of, I think the hardest ask will be residential and work visas to basically be super expedited. And it's a pretty big ask. And so we'll see what that looks like once we actually get there. But I think we're in once we get there, we'll also be in a relatively good negotiating position. The government is in a fiscal crisis and needs to create jobs. So I think we'll be hopefully able to get a really good deal put together that I also do think will benefit the government long term.
So do I hear it correctly that you kind of want to use also private money for large infrastructure projects or for large public goods? And
yeah,
how would be the return model for the private capital?
Increase in land value. So basically here, we'll acquire about 70,000 acres, about 40,000 is buildable. Our cost basis for acquisition was going to end up being between $5,000 and $10,000 an acre. We look at American cities, cost of land in American cities between $1 and $5 million an acre, and kind of downtown American cities, it's $20 million an acre. And we'll have about 8 miles of beachfront, which is much more valuable than that will be highly valued. So we capture the upside with, I suspect, looking at the long term, it's kind of 60 to 70% of value creation will be increase in land value. Then two, kind of a Singaporean state capitalism model where we want a very effective internal market, but we also, I think, will be able to invest in key strategic industries. And if you look, a lot of the large companies on the Singaporean Stock Exchange are either majority owned or heavy minority participation by Temasek or GIC or other government-owned entities. And so I do anticipate we'll have opportunities for kind of strategic investments in key industries that we think will have positive spillover effects, but can also lead to better financial returns for the operating company.
And then it would be a large fund who would basically own the land and like return like pass on the returns to whoever invested, or
If I can have it my way, I plan to be a majority owner of the land. So what we're doing is we're doing a joint venture structure with the current landowners. So they chip in land, we chip in capital. And I think with a little bit of luck, I can structure it in a way where the basic challenge is if we do a standard fund structure, the land development time is a little bit too long. Because most of the land we need to kind of develop a core area for probably 7 to 10 years, which is substantially underdeveloped, and we don't have large land owning there. And so we're not going to develop the greenfield site until 7 to 10 years, which makes the economics quite difficult. So right now we're targeting high net worth individuals from a tech background who have a relatively high risk appetite. And also kind of believe in the long-term vision of this project. Once we have that structured, then for specific infrastructure projects, right, we can just do standard project finance because it's much easier. But at this stage, given the uncertainty, given the unclear time horizons, the capital is a little bit more risky, and standard infrastructure or real estate funds are kind of going to be not terribly enthusiastic given that uncertainty and the broader market conditions.
There was also a question over here, no? Was it? Yeah.
I was just wondering, I mean, well, I had two questions. The first question was about, I've read that like Honduras has been trying some interesting things. And I don't know if that's the country that you're looking at, but can you talk a little bit about what their experience, what their experience has been?
Yeah, so the basic history is in 2009, Paul Romer, who later won a Nobel Prize in Economics, gives a TED talk on charter cities. First he goes to Madagascar. There's a coup there that's probably not his fault. Then he goes to Honduras. Honduras was operating in an immediate post-coup environment, and they passed basically charter cities legislation. He ended up getting into a fight with them, accusing them of lack of transparency. They accused him of being an asshole. And then the Supreme Court ruled that law unconstitutional. They fired half the Supreme Court justices, passed a very similar law. That very similar law is now still in effect. Broad challenge in Honduras. The law is kind of very extensive. It allows for a lot of kind of local autonomy. The one thing it does not allow for is kind of much more open migration and visas. So basically, it's legally required. I think the requirement is like 90% Honduran employment. But you have a lot of freedom in terms of creating and designing new legal structures. However, the basic challenge is, right, there was one political party that passed it, the legislation, and it wasn't one political party that passed it, it was literally like 5 people in that party. There was never any broad-based support for these ideas. That party was the Nationalist Party. Latin American and particularly Honduran politics is kind of like American politics, except instead of there being a left and right, it's like literal fascists and literal communists. And so this was basically the literal fascist party. They ended up stealing one election, maybe more. They recently got voted out of power. Now it's the people who are literal communists. And they very much don't like this law. They repealed it, and there's currently a fight going on to figure out like how sticky is it. The law has some provisions that basically mean that even if you repeal it, the existing zones have some operating capacity in the future, but trying to operate in a country that hates your guts and is throwing up bureaucratic hurdles, even if law is on your side, makes it difficult. So currently there are 3 projects in Honduras, Prospera, Ciudad Morazan, and Orcaida. Prospera is the one that you probably have heard of. It's on Roatan. It's kind of targeting more kind of tech workers. And the future is a little bit uncertain because you have a country that's kind of cracking down. They aren't cracking down as aggressively as they were 9 months ago, but I think it'll be hard to kind of scale and attract more investment when the government is actively hostile to you. And so what we're trying very hard to do is to structure this deal in a way that government benefits over the long term, as well as the local people and the business community, to align incentives as well as ensure adequate legal protections to minimize the risk of kind of future expropriation or changing of minds.
Building a charter city sounds cool, and obviously there's a lot that goes into that, and it's a challenge, and so it must be exciting to overcome the challenges of it. But I'm curious, like, why build a charter city, I view myself as a sociologist and a technology builder to an economist, and you can imagine some of my skepticism just based on the disciplinary tensions. I'm just curious, like, why build a charter city? What is it you're trying to do in the world, and why is building a charter city the way to do it best?
Yeah, the slightly but not fully facetious answers because I can. It seems fun.
No, and I asked a question with a little friendliness and playfulness, but
Okay.
I'm curious.
Yeah, so on a practical level, right, being in the Caribbean or long term, kind of short term, it's going to be like tourism and second home driven. Long term, I think it's going to be what might be described as immigration arbitrage driven, where H-1B applications have risen from about 200,000 annually in the US to 450,000. I expect that number to continue to increase, and the US only grants 85,000 a year. I never expect the US to become substantially more welcoming. There's basically a huge delta in terms of people, like talented people who want to live in the US who are unable to live there. I think we can offer good opportunity for them, being several hours from New York, being the same time zone. And kind of compete with Canada in terms of lower housing prices, lower taxes, and better weather. And then kind of the broad, impact I want to have is kind of progress studies-esque. Progress studies being the idea, if you look at from 1900 to 1960, like, and looked at somebody's house, everything changed, right? You have a car with internal combustion, you have a refrigerator, you have a TV, you have a radio, you have indoor plumbing. 1960 to today, basically very little changed. You have a supercomputer in your pocket and you have a much larger TV. However, right, does that outweigh electricity and internal combustion, et cetera, et cetera? So on some margin, kind of innovations and progress have slowed down. I don't know exactly why that is. However, by kind of creating a place that allows for creates a little bit of a new frontier, creates a place for people to innovate a little bit more, to have newer ideas. I think that hopefully can lead to a degree of innovation. And then two, if we look historically, right, like China would be what it is today without Hong Kong, where Hong Kong allowed China to be like, hey, look, they're rich, they're Chinese, and then they created a special economic zone in Shenzhen, and then that led to large reformation throughout China, which lifted 800 million people out of poverty, arguably the greatest humanitarian success in history. And that the same thing obviously is not going to happen in the US, but I do believe like the US government in particular has been sclerotic and stagnant and failed in numerous areas in creating a very effective jurisdiction relatively close offshore that demonstrates it is possible to be governed more effectively. I think can hopefully lead to some second order effects in reforming American governance to be more effective, more innovative, and hopefully kind of change some things that hopefully allow for a little bit more long-term economic growth and flourishing.
Question from Jeff.
Before I speak, I just want to say, because I think we can all be a carrier of the space, you can also enter the space from the other side. So just, in the future of the day, if you see someone crossing all the rooms to go there, then there is a shortcut, so you can spread the word. Hey, Mark, I'm extremely uncomfortable in this talk, but I'm an architect and I'm French, so imagine it's like even worse. But it's cool. I love it because I feel a bit challenged, not with my communist utopian friends. I feel okay. So for me, the one thing already is just like when. I guess I'm sitting a bit uncomfortable and knowing the history of cities, that, can we really create cities from like an outside kind of top-down perspective? For me, like Brasilia, a lot of cities in their history have shown that even rapid growth in terms of building construction, etc., is a city needs to correspond to kind of the human self, which is also an organic growth and development. It can't just be like boxes and then we put all the ingredients and it just comes out. So I guess I'm always a bit suspicious on that.
I'm broadly sympathetic to the argument. I So our urban planning is, do you know Lutter? He has a book, Order Without Design. We're working with his protege, and our kind of urban planning framework is to create public spaces, create private spaces, and then basically like New York with a grid, right? Like here's the grid, here where the roads are going to be, here where the parks are going to be, and then sell individual plots, and then allow people to build what they want on those plots. So we're not trying to, I think there's a kind of balance to be struck between overly planning. We don't want to be Brasilia and kind of plan every last detail and make it look like an airplane from the sky. We need to be reactive to demand and where demand comes from. But I think in general, cities are good. Cities are a major driver of innovation, of human flourishing. Like most good things in the world come from cities. And so having more effective cities is important, but balancing that with, is there demand? How to make sure that we don't make it soulless, how to make sure that we have a degree of vibrancy, of kind of openness, of obviously in kind of architecture and then in the culture more broadly, and how we can strike that balance in terms of the people we attract, in terms of the demand sequencing and development sequencing and all of that. So I'm sure we disagree on certain margins with how that will play out, but I am broadly sympathetic. I don't want to overplan. It's not going to be like one of these dumb Middle Eastern cities that like.
Are you working with local people? I mean, like if it's in the Caribbean, for instance.
Yeah. So we are working with. We have 2 former ministers who are on our team, as well as somebody who's lived on the island for 50 years. We haven't engaged the broader community yet because we're engaged in sensitive negotiations with the government as well as with the asset owners. However, the local community the first reaction of the local community will be skepticism, because they're very skeptical of new projects, because most of the new projects don't work. As soon as
They're also skeptical, because I think they've been left out for so long. I mean, living in a rural area where basically you can see like the concentration of power, and you're even more kind of like, they are taking, those white men are taking the decisions for us, and we're outside of the thing is like, is my fear there. I mean, if you're talking about governance and innovation, I would say people are so skeptical of current institutions, and there's a strong desire across the planet for like institutional innovation. And I mean, this is going to be also primary stuff. And I think, like, as a result, I think there's a huge opportunity for cities to have better governance systems because they've been built with the people and because they are like,
I think the average person on the island will be very, very happy when we start creating jobs. If you look at the communities, they're basically reminiscent of small towns in the US, where what happened is, right, in the US, manufacturing jobs left in the 70s, all the talented people left, and you were left with broken families and high rates of drug addiction. That's effectively what happened here when the tourism left. And I think we will start getting a very large amount of local support when we start creating good jobs and allowing people to. I also think we'll have a pretty aggressive campaign to convince people who have left either to the US or to other islands to return. But I think, the way we get local buy-in is to create the opportunity for these people to have better lives, and it probably will not sustain in the long term if we don't do that.
Thank you. I'm sorry we have to finish this session. Thank you so much, Mark.